Well, hello, everyone. Tony Costa here from Toronto Apologetics. So glad that you guys could join us this evening or wherever you may be on God's planet Earth. And it's good to have you along. And tonight we're going to be having a very interesting discussion. It's probably not the normal discussions that you would expect on the existence of God. We usually deal with questions to do with the cosmological argument, the transcendental argument, or the ontological argument, the fine-tuning of the universe, and there's an array of arguments that are usually marshaled by theists and Christians, of course, to argue for the existence of God. But tonight we're going to be taking a different angle on this, and my guest is going to be talking about the argument from beauty for the existence of God. And when was the last time you heard something like that, the argument from beauty? And so I have the great pleasure of having on my dear friend Dale. Dale, you're muted. Just to let you know, you're muted. There you go. And no, folks, Dale is not in Jerusalem. That is just a background picture. Although we'd like to be there. A lot of history there, and of course the biblical lens. But Dale, it's such a pleasure to have you on. Welcome again.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure being on your show. And I think the last time I was here, I did a presentation on the Shroud of Turin. So
yes,
I'm glad to kind of switch gears and do something that's different. So yeah,
that was a fantastic show that we had on the Shroud of Turin. And those of you who are who've heard about the Shroud of Turin, I'd like to highly recommend Dale. He does a lot of talks in this area, and so if you're in the Toronto area or the GTA, you can. I'll put his information is already in the description box. But if you want Dale to come by and speak on the Shroud, maybe at a Sunday school or maybe a Wednesday night meeting, a Bible study prayer meeting. Please connect with Dale. And also, if you're not in Toronto, if you're somewhere else, then I'm sure, Dale, you could also, you can accommodate them, I guess, virtually.
Yeah,
you could do a presentation virtually as well. So you don't have to be physically in Canada, in Toronto. Dale can accommodate you with a virtual lecture. And I would highly recommend it. I've known Dale for many, many years. He was a student of mine at Toronto Baptist Seminary way back in the day when he had struggles with his faith. He was really struggling and trying to seek answers and so on. And to make a long story short, I connected him with a dear friend at Liberty University, Dr. Gary Habermas, who's a specialist in the resurrection of Jesus. And the Lord used that avenue to just bring Dale to faith. And so I had the great honor of baptizing Dale as well. And so he's a dear brother. I've seen him just grow through the years, and now he's got his own channel called Real Seeker Ministries, and he's engaged with a number of very well-known authors and scholars. And I've been on his channel as well I debated a friend of his on the ontological argument and many other topics as well. And so, Dale, again, I'm so proud of you. I'm so happy to see how far you've come and just the tremendous work that you are doing.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it means a lot to me. Like you said, when I first met you, I was an unbeliever and quite skeptical, as Tony can attest. And I had all these questions and stuff. So yeah, it's amazing how far I've come and stuff like that. So yeah.
Indeed. So Dale, tell us a little bit about this argument, the argument from beauty and how it relates to the existence of God. I think you have a PowerPoint you want to share.
I do. Yep. All right.
Okay. I think you just need to bring it up there and I'll put it on the screen.
All right.
Just share screen there. There we go. And I will, there we go. Perfect.
And is
that's full screen. So you go right ahead, Dale, and you do your thing, and give us this argument from beauty.
There we go.
So I should have played the "I'm a Barbie girl," at the beginning. That should have been my intro song, right? I'm a Barbie girl living in a Barbie world.
That would have been perfect. I'm disappointed that you forgot to do
I
that.
can't believe I forgot. But, so go ahead, brother.
All right, awesome. So basically, I wanted to give an argument that I find is often neglected in Christian apologetics, even by myself. My favorite argument is the ontological argument, as Tony knows, and cosmological arguments or even moral arguments. But the argument from beauty is something that's really kind of neglected by a lot of apologists. And so I had an opportunity when I was doing my master's in philosophy. I took a philosophy of aesthetics course. And in that, for my final paper, I said, what the heck? I'm going to try and develop a unique argument for God from beauty based on aesthetic values and aesthetic value judgments.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, just by way of introduction, as Christians, we know that obviously God, the Bible tells us that God is the ultimate foundation for beauty in the world. He's the one who created the universe and all of the beauty that we see in it. So he's ultimately the grounding for these aesthetic values and judgments. But I wanted to turn that into an argument. So just by way of sort of a simple modus ponens, or affirming the antecedent, two premise argument. So we can say that premise number one, aesthetic values and value judgments exist in the world. This is just obvious from everyone's experience. Then premise two, if aesthetic values and value judgments exist, then I argue the theistic dispositional realism hypothesis is the best explanation for these. And obviously it follows from that theistic dispositional realism is true. It's the best explanation. So the first thing we need to do is kind of look at premise one. What exactly are these aesthetic values and value judgments? I think there are certain features of our aesthetic experience of these that can be telling when we're judging, which hypotheses are good. And on that front, so they have several features of what I call the relevant aesthetic features. So just by way of summarizing, I list about 7 of them. Mm-hmm. So these are the features that we're trying to explain. So the first is there are aesthetic correctness conditions, right? So people's aesthetic judgments can be correct. They're either true or false. A person's aesthetic values can be correct or erroneous. And one example that people might give is think of a serial killer who, sorry to get so grim on your show, but they chop off all their victims' heads and they put them up on pikes and they go, oh, that's so beautiful.
Well, I'll have you know, Dale, that when people check me up on Google, there's a serial killer called Tony Costa, the Cape Cod serial killer, believe it or not. So the same name, and so I've been to some churches where some people said, I looked you up. I mean, that's an amazing testimony how you went from being a serial killer to a Christian. I said, that is not me. I'm not the man. But anyway,
that's crazy. I had no idea about that. So, yeah,
serial killer.
Yeah. You were not the one putting up these heads in your backyard. So.
No.
Yeah, but the point remains. You can kind of see what I'm saying there is that no, we want to say that aesthetically speaking, that is wrong. To value a grotesque, ugly sight like that is incorrect, and stuff like that. And it's a false judgment to say that is beautiful sight or something like that. The second major aspect that a lot of philosophers of aesthetics talk about is that there are aesthetic value disagreements. Mm-hmm. This is just clear from the art. Like we have a bunch of artists and they all disagree with each other. Is the Mona Lisa really beautiful or does it suck? What about Picasso and abstract art? That's something that I just don't value myself. But a lot of artists and stuff like that will beg to differ with me. So value disagreements in the aesthetic world is just a fact of our world. Mm-hmm. The third feature that I think the hypothesis needs to explain is aesthetic refinement. We recognize that people's aesthetic values and judgments become more refined with things like education or training, or as one grows up and stuff like that. Your aesthetic taste, so to speak, mm-hmm. Can mature. And this is a fact of our world. So number 4 and number 5 are kind of related. So whenever you hear the debate for the argument from beauty, it's always one side or the other, right? So the typical atheists online, they'll want to say, well, aesthetic values, they're subjective and that sort of thing. Whereas Christians, we want to say, no, it's objective. It doesn't matter what human opinions are and stuff like that. It's based in the object.
Right.
Now, what I'm kind of interesting here is that I'm saying I think both are actually part of our experience. So number 4 is that the aesthetic object is relevant for grounding our values and our judgments, right? So the properties of the object itself, whatever it is, a piece of music or a beautiful sunset or something, that the properties have to play some kind of role. And one way to kind of argue for that, I've seen a fellow philosopher, Philip Talon, in the book 24 Arguments for God's Existence. He's kind of used this destruction argument where he says, well, look, let's say we have a beautiful temple and it's destroyed by ISIS and it's forever gone. We obviously value that temple and we feel a loss of the original beauty of that temple or whatever. But if a scientist came to us and said, well, look, I can virtually reproduce that entire temple down to the last T, and it's exactly the same as it was before it was destroyed, but it's virtual, it's not real. I would argue that aesthetically speaking, we don't value the virtual copy as much as the object itself. There's something about the properties than the object there. Now, the 5th aspect, here's where I would agree with atheists, is that, well, if we're talking about values and value judgments, then an aesthetic subject is necessary. An agent is necessary, right? Because values, well, who can have values? It's only a conscious subject, such as human beings or something.
Right.
Who can make evaluations? Well, it's a subject that has a mind and can think and know propositions and stuff like that. So the subject is also necessary. Sixthly, this one's kind of interesting, that there's our moral values and our aesthetic values are often correlated. And I'm not meaning this fact in terms of ontologically. I'm just saying psychologically. There have been several studies in modern psychology demonstrating this correlation that human beings have. So for some reason, for example, we might, when we look at someone aesthetically and we're not attracted to them, if we later find out in this particular study, they were studying honesty. So if you found out, well, actually, this guy behaves morally or a girl behaves morally, and they're very honest, that tends to increase our aesthetic judgment about these people. It makes them more attractive to us, literally speaking. And there are several other psychological-based studies that show these kinds of correlations, and that requires an explanation. Finally, number 7 is aesthetic non-deference. So this is kind of the tendency to say, I'm not going to defer to what anybody else values aesthetically. No, Picasso sucks. That's what I think. And I don't care if all the experts say it's the greatest thing on earth. I'm not going to defer to them. We have this tendency as human beings to go, no, I'm making my aesthetic judgment and I know what I value and I'm sticking with that. I'm not going to bend the knee to just, an art expert or something like that. So yeah, that's the 7 features there. Does that make sense, Tony? Any questions on the features or?
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So now the second part is we need to come up with an explanatory hypothesis. What is the best explanation for explaining these features? And as we evaluate some of the hypotheses given by philosophers of aesthetics, I'm going to be judging them by these criteria. So plausibility, is the hypothesis plausible to a greater degree given our background knowledge or our background evidence that's relevant? Explanatory scope. So obviously that directly applies to these. How many of the 7 features of our aesthetic experience does it explain? Explanatory power is how well does it explain it? Does does it do so, but it takes effort, or there's vagueness or ambiguity or something. Yeah. And finally, simplicity, right? So less ad hoc. Does it employ non-evidenced assumptions and that sort of thing? So obviously the best explanation will perform the best on these 4 criteria there. So with that said, what are the explanatory hypotheses? And I list about 7 here. So, and I may skip a couple just depending on timing. But so the first is aesthetic emotivism. Second is aesthetic subjectivism. Thirdly, we have aesthetic objectivism. That's where most Christians, I would say, fall. Then we have aesthetic Platonism. There are several evolutionary explanations. And then we come to natural dispositional realism, and what I'm going to be proposing, theistic dispositional realism. This is the one that I've invented and will be hopefully arguing for. Okay, so you can see it sort of splits. This is just a helpful diagram showing the different theories based on realism versus an anti-realism perspective on the values, right? Is the aesthetic value grounded in some property of an object? That's realism, or is it not? And this is just kind of a way of diagramming where they fit. All right. So the first theory is aesthetic emotivism. And this was advanced by the famous atheist philosopher A.J. Ayer, who also advocated for moral emotivism. So basically, he argued that aesthetic values and judgments are ultimately, they just reduce down to our emotions. Those represent our values, and our expressions of those emotions. Okay, that's the wrong word there. That should say evaluations. Sorry. Yeah. And our evaluations. So that's just us expressing in propositional form what our emotions are. So it's kind of, akin to saying, yay, Michelangelo, boo, Picasso, or vice versa. Interesting on that front, back in the early 20th century, a guy named Clive Bell, he actually kind of argued that there was a separate emotion. There's a thing called an aesthetic emotion that's different from all our other emotions and stuff like that. But I don't think that's very ad hoc and stuff like that. And I would say it's implausible, but it's an option to be aware of. So, yeah. So in terms of plausibility, I say that the emotivism position is implausible because our emotions and their expression don't really fit our aesthetic values and stuff like that. And they apply in different cases. So, for example, happiness, does that correlate precisely with, aesthetic beauty, or is sadness correlated with ugliness? That it just seems implausible because these same emotions apply in different scenarios. They can't be reduced down to, also, in terms of explanatory power, it's inconsistent with our properly basic beliefs about aesthetic facts or correctness conditions. Because, look, our emotions are neither correct nor incorrect. They just are. It's a phenomenological experience. And that seems to be inconsistent with our aesthetic values, which we know can be correct or incorrect and stuff like that. So that's a major problem. It doesn't explain that. And then it's also inconsistent with normative aesthetic oughts and imperatives and stuff like that. So that's the same point. I think it also fails in terms of aesthetic valuational disagreements, right? So if I'm just expressing my emotions and experiencing emotions, if somebody has differing emotions, well, there's no need to disagree. They're just experiencing whatever emotions they're experiencing, and there's no correctness condition. So why would there ever be any disagreements? I don't think it can explain that. Finally, there's no aesthetic refinement or growth, right? There's no development. It's not like there's some objective standard whereby our aesthetic tastes or our values can get better and better relative to that standard. No, they just are whatever they are, and stuff like that. So The other thing I said is Clive Bell, as I said, if we're going to posit a special aesthetic emotion, that's totally ad hoc. There's no evidence for some kind of special emotion or something like that. And in fact, I would say when I look at a piece of art that I like or dislike, I'm just experiencing the same emotions that I have in other contexts, such as happiness or sadness or anger or whatever it is. So yeah, that's it on this one. So emotivism does not do a good job at all. Okay, so next we come to the most popular one for atheists, aesthetic subjectivism. So this is an anti-realist position. So it says the objects themselves are irrelevant, and their properties. They're not necessary for grounding these values and judgments, because beauty is solely in the eye of the beholder, in the perceiving subject. Oh, sorry. So yeah, basically all truths are, under this position, they'll say truths are relative. It's relative to the person. Is this beautiful to you? Well, then that's true for you. Is it ugly for you, or disvaluable to you? Well, that's true for you. So that's another major aspect of this feature, is that aesthetic truths are relative. So yeah, I think that is totally implausible, right? Subjective relativism, it seems incompatible or problematic with the correspondence theory of truth in the first place, where what's true or not is basically when a proposition corresponds to reality itself.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a bit of background knowledge that I think contradicts this. Also, I think that we need to assume that, this theory assumes that object relevance is not needed to explain aesthetic language. And unfortunately, our aesthetic language, we presuppose that, no, this is an objective truth, that this is beautiful or this is ugly. Our language itself presupposes that there are these objective truth conditions, and one can be right or wrong.
Right.
So subjectivism fails there. Obviously, in terms of subjectivism, I already made Philip Talon's destruction argument for the object relevance, and the properties are needed, right? Remember that destruction of the temple, you need that temple, you need the sunset itself. There's something about the sunset that is beautiful. All right, and I gave the correctness conditions. I don't think it explains aesthetic refinement either, because again, if everything's subjective, okay, great. Maybe as a subject you value a painting at time one, and then at a later time you change your mind. But again, there is no objective standard against which your opinions need to be judged. So it fails on that end. I think those are my things on aesthetic subjectivism. As you can see, it gets red on those three. All right. Okay, so now we come to aesthetic objectivism, and this is where a lot of Christians will probably fit in. And it says, look, it grounds these aesthetic values solely in the properties of the aesthetic objects themselves. So there are certain reductionist versions. So people like Aristotle, they'll say, well, what's beautiful, the beautiful values or something, they reduce down to some natural property of the object, such as symmetry. Symmetry, that is what we call beautiful. Or proportionality or something like that, some natural property. And a lot of people that have studied this in philosophy have said, well, this doesn't actually work, because aesthetic properties seem to be irreducible. They're basic in their own right. And in fact, this has been proven in certain evolutionary studies by a guy who's studying birds. And his name is Prum, if I remember, Richard Prum. And we find in nature that aesthetic values or aesthetic properties are irreducible. That's just the way they work in nature. I think if you go with this option, you have to go with some non-reductionist. So aesthetic properties are emergent in some way. All right. So that's what are some of the problems with this? So the first thing I would say is implausible, I think, because aesthetic values, they're not merely descriptive, but they're normative in nature. And our evaluations and judgments require a subject.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again, evaluations require an evaluator. Values require an experiencer to have that qualia of significance. So that's something that this view doesn't really explain well. Also, non-aesthetic properties are different to aesthetic ones, as I mentioned, has been shown in certain scientific studies. And we need, okay. The other thing I wanted to say about this, if you go down the aesthetic supervenience route, there is some ad hocness about this. We're assuming that, okay, the certain physical objects have these emergent aesthetic properties which emerge and stuff like that. That could be seen as an ad hoc element. So that's my take on that. And you can see, so this one does pretty well. It's only really these two that I think it kind of struggles with. And that's something I should have mentioned is it doesn't explain the aesthetic and moral value correlations as well. All right. How am I doing on time?
You're doing good. Doing good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll just cover this one and then I'll go to dispositional realism. But
okay.
Aesthetic Platonism is it's a supernatural position similar to moral Platonism, right? And it says the grounding of aesthetic values and judgments are basically grounded in properties of aesthetic objects through their participation in certain aesthetic forms. So there's this heavenly form of beauty,
right,
or a heavenly form of ugliness. And if a given object on earth participates in that form, well, that's when you can say it's beautiful or judge it to be ugly or whatever aesthetic judgment you make. Yeah. Now, obviously, in terms of my assessment of this value, it's kind of a similar critique that William Lane Kraay gives against moral Platonism. Look, in the first place, it's totally implausible to think of these forms as abstract ideas or objects that can just exist independently. Yeah. I don't think that makes sense.
Yeah, they're just floating there. They're just floating without any grounding.
Exactly. That makes no sense. No, I'm more of a divine conceptualist. Sure. Ideas exist in the mind of God.
Sure.
And values, they exist in God. They're God's values and stuff.
Right.
Ultimately. So, in terms of explanatory scope, so it does not account for the need of the aesthetic subjects either. There's seemingly no role. It's just whether the object on earth participates in this form,
right?
Heavenly form. So it doesn't really explain the need for the aesthetic subject and their judgments or values. And it doesn't explain why there's a correlation between the moral and aesthetic values or judgments. So, why is it that human beings almost seem designed to want to correlate to good moral values and also good aesthetic values versus the opposite, like what? Yeah. In terms of explanatory power, it does not account for aesthetic correctness conditions at all. Like I said, what makes it correct? If a given object adheres to the beautiful form as opposed to the garish form, what makes that correct or not? There's no reason that I ought to align with what we call aesthetically good values or make certain judgments and stuff like that. No, I can just, adhere, make a judgment and say, yeah, this is garish and that's good. So yeah, and finally, the notion of Plato's forms, this kind of Platonic realm, is immensely ad hoc. The evidence is very much against it, but it's ancient Greek philosophy. So what do you expect? All right, cool. So those are the four. I'm going to skip over the evolutionary one just for time's sake, unless you want me to cover it.
Yeah, I mean we're at 8:00. Unless you want to go for another 30, 35 minutes, and then we can take some questions. Would that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right, cool. So now there are certain evolutionary explanations as well, and there are at least 5 different ones. So the first one is basically just ordinary sexual or natural selection
Mm-hmm.
type aesthetic features are conducive to or indicative of the natural property that allows you to be more adaptable or
Mm-hmm.
fit to survive and reproduce your genes. There are other theories, such as the null theory, which says that beauty is a fundamental, irreducible property that attracts sexual partners. So that's really what we call beautiful is what helps us attract sexual partners.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the biophilia hypothesis, which says aesthetic values are grounded in habitat selection in our evolutionary past, right? Why do we value a beautiful lake or a mountain or green trees and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, those habitats were beneficial for us. There's also the social cohesion hypothesis that says aesthetic values allow for survival of communities rather than individuals and stuff. And that's sort of the main highlight. So I just want to focus on the first of these, which is the natural selection type thing. That beautiful is what allows us to spread our genes. That's what we call and helps us to survive to the point where we can do that. Now, in terms of plausibility, look, Charles Darwin himself observed that natural selection alone could not explain why many animal traits are conferred, but they give us a survival cost. So they're actually detrimental to being able to survive. And the perfect example is the peacock's feathers, very beautiful. But scientists have shown that it actually harms their ability to survive. It comes at a cost, they're more noticeable to predators, stuff like that, right? So, yeah. Again, it also doesn't address why is there this psychological correlation between our moral values and our aesthetic values in any way? So far, this is a common trend. None of the theories, I think, really address this. Natural selection doesn't care about ethics, let alone beauty and stuff like that. So
one thing I was just going to say, Dale, is it's funny how in the human race, beauty is usually associated with the female. It's the female that gets all decked out, the makeup and everything. Whereas the guys tend to be a bit more bland. But in the animal kingdom, it's quite interesting. It's the males that have the beauty, the colors. Think of even various fish. The males, even the common guppy, for example, has these beautiful colors to attract the females to court. And I just find it interesting. The lion has the mane. It just seems to me that in the animal kingdom, the males seem to have the what we would call aesthetic beauty, whereas in the human realm, the human sphere, its beauty is usually associated with women. I mean, we don't say, "Oh, that's a beautiful man." We'll say that's a handsome man. But beauty, we usually allocate that term for the female in the human race. So I've always found that quite interesting. That it's almost like the reversed between the animal kingdom and the human kingdom in terms of the male-female relation.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating as well. I think you're absolutely right. In most species and stuff, it is the male that is the colorful one, what we would call beauty and stuff like that. Right. So yeah, that's a great point. I'm hearing an echo now.
Oh, let me just mute myself so that doesn't distract you.
Oh, sorry. All right, cool. So in terms of the natural selection evolutionary hypothesis, it doesn't account for the correctness conditions, right? Because in fact, in our experience, it's actually the opposite, because we tend to aesthetically value things that are dangerous to our survival. That tiger looks really, really beautiful, but that thing's going to kill you. Or snow-capped mountains are seen as very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing to human beings, but we can't survive in that habitat and stuff like that. So there seems to be, in certain cases, there's even a mismatch where we are almost designed, for lack of a better word, to have incorrect judgments and value things that are actually dangerous to our survivability. And here's what I was talking about you. So here's the study with ornithologists. So he studies birds, Richard Prum. He's actually proven that subjective experiences of beauty are fundamental in biology. So natural selection or evolutionary survival or mate fitness, none of these things, beauty is not reducible to these natural properties. Even in the animal kingdom, beauty is a fundamental aspect of biology. And this is something that is becoming accepted in modern science as well. So that's something that's very fascinating there. Okay. In terms of ad hocness, I think it's ad hoc that evolutionary mechanisms, including the natural selection, could be capable of producing aesthetic values within life forms on their own without any intelligent design. So this is kind of where, when we're looking at correlations, between aesthetic and moral values, why would it just so happen that what's good for survival aligns with what we call morally good and aesthetically good in all cases, even when the facts on the ground indicate that it would count against survival. So yeah, that's what that point is. It's suggestive that there's some kind of intelligent design aligning our values. All right, so this is just the visual form. I said it fails on these two fronts for the evolutionary, and these ones are questionable. All right, so now we get into what I think is the proper solution. But first, we have to start with the natural dispositional realism. So this was a position advocated by an atheist, David Hume, and then later Michael Sloat in the 20th century. But this is the view that I think is more a better explanation, because it recognizes that aesthetic objects are necessary to ground our values and our judgments, that the properties of these objects are needed. But also the aesthetic subject is necessary to have these values and to make these judgments. So what Michael Sloat argued and David Hume is that they say, well, aesthetic objects have certain dispositional properties. These are properties that dispose the proper aesthetic agent or subject to respond in a given way, to value the sunset as beautiful, or to see the garbage heap as disgusting and ugly, and to make that judgment and stuff like that. So the properties of these objects dispose me or the proper aesthetic agent to respond, to have that value experience, and to make the appropriate judgment. So obviously, part of this view is you have to ask, well, who is the proper aesthetic subject then? And what David Hume and Michael Sloat argue is that, well, it's not just any old human being, because obviously then that's just boils down to aesthetic subjectivism. No, there is an objective standard, but it's the aesthetic expert, the art expert. That's who all human beings ought to defer to in their values and aesthetic judgments. So obviously it's a natural theory, and it just assumes that the only aesthetic agents are human beings. These are the only agents that we know of as a conscious subject. So therefore there must be art experts, people who are trained, they're properly qualified and educated. And there's a lot of debate in the philosophy of aesthetics as to what qualifies you and stuff like that. But there is sort of a consensus among having certain education, certain experience in terms of judging art and stuff like that. And they say this distinguishes you from Jim Bob Jones or me, the lowly plebs who, we don't have the right to make our own aesthetic values or judgments. We just defer to whatever the elites tell us.
Yeah, let me just say, Dale, that you're very correct. Even the University of Toronto, where I'm at, they have their own department of art history, or the it used to be called the fine art department. And so you have academics there who, as you said, are specialists in the field, and they don't just deal with the history of art throughout human history, but what exactly is art? What is aesthetics, and what is its relationship to art? So you're quite correct. It is definitely an academic discipline as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, obviously, what do we say? How does natural dispositional realism do? Well, in the first place, I do think it is plausible. I don't think there are any implausible elements to it. In terms of explanatory scope, though, as you'll see here, I think it can't explain number 7, this aesthetic non-deference aspect, right? Why, if aesthetic values and judgments are grounded in the artistic experts, it should just be automatic that everybody wants to defer to, oh, if they like this painting, then I like it too. But our experience is the opposite. We don't want, human beings, generally speaking, don't want to defer. We say, I don't care what, the art guy in the fine arts department, what he says, I don't like it, or I like it, period, kind of thing. So I think it fails to explain that. I would also say it fails the aesthetic and moral value correlations, because as Tony will attest, right, an ethics department at a university is totally separate from the aesthetic department. So just because you're an aesthetic expert, or you have a fancy dancy degree in art history or art appreciation or something like that, that doesn't mean you're going to also be a moral expert at the same time. So why is there this correlation? That's not explained under this theory. And finally, aesthetic value disagreements. Okay, so this one's problematic because even among the art experts, they still have the same problem. Not all art, it's not like art experts have a universal consensus. This painting's good, this one's bad. No, they have bitter disagreements amongst each other. So in that case, who do you believe? Who's right? Who's got the correct aesthetic value among these art experts? Is it Dr. Jones or is it Dr. Smith? Stuff like that. So I think this theory struggles on that front. Yep. All right. So now we come to the final one. This is what I think is the solution. Theistic dispositional realism. So basically, this view works exactly the same as natural dispositional realism. It says, yep, the object's properties are necessary, but they're dispositional properties. They're properties that dispose the proper aesthetic subject to respond by having the appropriate value and making the appropriate value judgment. But who is the proper aesthetic subject? I argue it's God. God is the ultimate judge. And it is ultimately his aesthetic values and his value judgments that ought to ground our own. We ought to defer to God. Does God think this is beautiful or grotesque? And that's what we defer to. And it's the same way with moral values or epistemic values. It works exactly the same way. And we are designed as human beings to reflect. We are image bearers of God. So that's why we ought to defer to God's judgments. In terms of plausibility, the only potential issue here is, okay, well, on the background evidence, is it plausible that God exists? And I think given so many arguments we have, from the ontological argument to cosmological argument, it's not only plausible, it is extremely probable that God exists. So that's not really an issue. In terms of explaining all the features, I think it explains all the features. However, there is the aesthetic value disagreements issue. And I'll get to trying to explain that. Basically, it depends on what type of theism that you're positing as to how we can try and explain why are there value disagreements. Look, if you're saying God is the grounding of these values and judgments, and human beings are designed as image bearers of God to reflect that, why don't we? Why do we still disagree? We should all have the same universal judgments, right, in accordance with God. So that still requires an explanation. I'll come to that in a second. In terms of explanatory power, I think it explains all of the features. Again, we'll get into the value disagreements there. And I don't think there are any ad hoc, non-evidenced assumptions employed. So this is my kind of assessment on this front. Any questions so far, Tony, on that? Or
Sorry, I just muted myself there. No, everything is it's to me it's very coherent and straightforward. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. So so this is the only potential problem for the theistic dispositional realism thing. So how would I respond to that? How could a Christian or a theist respond to why are there value disagreements if we're designed to reflect God's judgments and values? Well, in the first place, we have to say that aesthetic value disagreements are nowhere near as widespread as many people think. Most of the disagreements, I would argue, are factual in nature. They're disagreements about certain facts, which may or may not be relevant to our aesthetic values and our judgments there. But it has to be admitted, there are still actual value disagreements. And on this front, it may be due to differences in the aesthetic hierarchy. So William Lane Craig mentions the moral hierarchy, right? So that there are certain moral principles, which I would say those are just reflections of moral values, right? Principles and values are the same thing. And in certain situations, because we live in a fallen world, we have to value one principle over another. Well, perhaps the differences are due to disagreements over the aesthetic hierarchy. Maybe in this fallen world, we have to choose one, we disagree over, well, this property is more aesthetically pleasing than this one or significant than another one. So is proportionality more valuable than simplicity? Well, maybe somebody disagrees. They value simplicity over proportionality or something like that. So that can be a cause for some of these disagreements. There's also differences in aesthetic development, education and refinement. Through education and refinement, we can learn certain things that help us to appreciate the aesthetic beauty and value of a given work of art or whatever it is, piece of music and stuff like that. And some people may disagree because they lack that knowledge and stuff like that. Also, with certain works, there is intentional ambiguity in the work itself. So think of modern abstract art, for example. These are intentionally designed by the artist to be ambiguous, to elicit differing opinions for differing subjects. And that's why we have certain disagreements, because we're supposed to. Fifthly, I would say that God designed people to value and judge some or all aesthetic objects differently. So here's another solution for the theist. They could say that, well, maybe God has designed me individually to value certain forms of music, like rap music, and he's designed Tony Costa to appreciate country and Western music or rock music or something. Maybe we are just designed to have differing aesthetic values. But at the end of the day, they're all good. Where God values country music as good and rap music as good, or rock music, or whatever it is, and stuff like that. That's a potential answer to it. But then there's number 6, and this is the Christian theism answer, I would say. It basically says, look, all human beings, our faculties we live in a fallen world, and they have been corrupted to varying degrees. And because of that corruption, it results in various moral, epistemic, and aesthetic disagreements. So the corrupting influence of sin and the fact that there was the fall, this can readily explain why there are aesthetic value disagreements and stuff like that, and why some human beings diverge from the original design plan and diverge from God's values and God's value judgments. So I would say that's the Christian theism answer, or at least one of them you can give. So yeah, that's it. That's everything for my presentation.
Okay. I thought you were going to have Porky Pig there at the end. Saying, biddy, that's all, folks. Yeah, no, that was great. That was great, Dale. and I hope your throat hasn't dried out from all that talking. But that was great. So I think aesthetics that's an area that we rarely hear about. We always hear about the moral argument, and as you said, the ontological argument. And so, what would your argument be then? That as a Christian theist, you would argue that aesthetics is ultimately grounded in God Himself.
Absolutely, yeah. So exactly the same way you would make the moral argument, right? Because these are all value-based arguments, right? We have aesthetic values, we have epistemic values, and we have moral values. So in the same way, our moral values are grounded in God's morally perfect nature. I would say aesthetic values are grounded in God's aesthetically perfect nature. And our aesthetic judgments and stuff like that are grounded in so far as we reflect God's aesthetic judgments and His mind. So yeah,
because some theologians, like even Augustine, would speak of when we're in glory, when we're in heaven. He speaks of seeing the beatific vision, and so he associates that idea of beauty with seeing God, and he sees God obviously as the beautiful one. That all beauty ultimately resides in the triune God. But it's interesting, to see beauty, you need a subject-object relation. You need to be looking at something. And it reminds me of George Berkeley's argument. The old argument, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a noise? And philosophers debated back and forth about this. But what Berkeley argued was, yes, it does make a noise because God hears it. And so I think that there seems to be some comparability here with this argument on aesthetics.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, yeah, we do need this subject, right, to ground these values in eternity, and God obviously fits that perfect bill. Now, God is a subject, but there's also, okay, so what would be something He would value as beauty? Say, taking creation out of it, like, is there beauty? How could beauty exist before creation or sunsets? For example, I think love is beautiful between the eternal loving relationship between the three persons of the Trinity and stuff like that. That's something that God aesthetically valued as beautiful. So yeah, I would say relations between the different members of the Trinity are more than enough to ground, and their properties are more than enough to ground all these values.
Right. And I would agree with that. So folks, if you're watching and you have any questions to ask our guest, Dale, just put a Q in the chat box if you have any questions. There was a comment that was made by Spiky Steve. I don't know if you know Spiky Steve.
No.
Okay. Nice pick, by the way, Spiky Steve. He retorts by saying, none of this proves God. You know that this is nonsense. So what would your response be to that, Dale?
So I would just say, in the first place, look, I actually submitted this argument to my atheist professor in my philosophy of aesthetics. Nothing to do with religion or God or anything like that, but I submitted this argument, and I think I got an A on it, and stuff like that from an atheist professor. So
that's beautiful. That's beautiful, Dale.
Yeah, at least he is that yeah, and I think God would agree. So, but yeah, so in the first place, I would just say, look, the various features that I mentioned, these are things that are well written in the philosophy of aesthetics literature. And in my version, I'll post up a blog for this show. I'll link to those secular papers that you can read. Nothing to do with Christianity or apologetics or anything like that. So these are well attested. And same with these theories. Dispositional realism was published in the Journal of Philosophy as a valid theory. And my goodness, it was advocated by David Hume, someone that I think Spiky Steve would like. I'm just improving upon it and saying that I think that adding in the theistic element is a better explanation. It's an abductive argument.
Right. Good point. Okay, so we have a comment here from Franny Cosmic. He makes the point that some of this sounds I think he meant or she meant very much like C.S. Lewis. And I think C.S. Lewis also, I think, wrote on the concept of beauty as well.
Yeah, believe it or not, I haven't read C.S. Lewis and stuff, so I don't know much about what he said, but I do know he did write about beauty and stuff like that. So if I'm on the same level as him on this front, then that's good company.
Yeah, it's a good comment here from Pam W. No matter what man makes or builds, it is always a far cry from creation. Then there's God, and that is true. I mean, when you look at a synthetic rose, or you look at a painting of Niagara Falls, or a painting of even the Mona Lisa, that is a copy. It's not the real thing. And it's interesting that man could replicate or imitate. That's probably a better term. That humans can imitate beauty that is in creation, but they can never produce that pristine original that God made, from which everything else proceeds in terms of reproduction and seeds and so forth and so on. So I think it's quite true that whatever we make is clearly an imitation, a copy. And I guess Plato would say, well, that's because there's this world of ideas. There's this form of beauty. But we would root it in God, because, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, Dale, even with morals, the Platonic moral view is that morals simply are there. He spoke of the good, but those morals are not rooted on anything. And then there's the youthful argument that Plato also puts forward. But I think that's a good point that Pam makes here, because it does call to mind again that we are inclined to imitate beauty. And I think the great artists, the Michelangelos, the Leonardo da Vinci, the Raphaels, all these great thinkers and artists, and sculptors as well, they were all intending to convey beauty. But at the same time, it's interesting that when you get into the postmodern age in the 70s and 80s, you get this different type of art that, I mean, you can go to the Guggenheim in New York, and there's a golden toilet there that people line up to use, and the name of that toilet is America. So obviously the artist didn't think very highly of America, but to some people that is, that's meaningful art. But yeah, I don't think a golden toilet, no matter how beautiful it is, how many carats, I don't think a toilet is really something that we would convey as beauty.
Yeah, it's obviously intended to be a disrespectful act, and that's not something God would value in any way. So, on that front, it's deviating from the design plan. And yeah, like you said, we are designed as human beings. One of the features, the 7 features, that non-deference. Well, theistic dispositional realism answers that, because we ought, as image bearers of God, we ought to emulate God's values and judgments, because we are designed to do that. And you might just say, well, why? Is it just some deontological rule or something? No, God designed us to be like him in this way, because that is ultimately what is for our best welfare. It's good for us to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that even when you look in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, near the end, where God gives his spirit to the designer of the tabernacle, and how God gives instructions about the beauty of the menorah, the candlestick, for example, or even the Ark of the Covenant, that they were to overlay with gold and place the cherubim on top, and the mercy seat. And then, of course, you have that beautiful embroidery in the Temple of Solomon, where it mentions cherubim and pomegranates and these various beautiful fruits. And so you see in the construction of the tabernacle, and later the temple, this design and this beauty that is attached to it. And even in the Psalms, David says, "Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness." And so that aesthetic concept is there. And of course, it's associated with God. So is God an artist? Well, yeah. I mean, look at humans, and also the way that he inspired the builders of the temple and the tabernacle, I mean, to create something beautiful. They didn't create the temple, you know, in a disorganized, chaotic fashion. They created it with order and with beauty as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, in my argument, I kind of watered it down. I just looked at the psychological correlation between moral values and aesthetic values. But this is based on an earlier tradition, and I think from a biblical perspective, but ancient Greek philosophy, they thought there was this ontological connection, and I think the Bible says that too. Like when in the creation, when it says the creation, it is good. That there's actually, you would probably know the Hebrew stuff, but there's an aesthetic aspect to the goodness. It's
Definitely
morally good, but it's aesthetically good.
Yeah. And it's you know, in Genesis 1:31, it uses the word tov ma'od. It's very good. So after God said, you know, light is good and trees are good and land is good, he goes through, you know, the 6 days of creation, and then at the very end, before God ceases from his work, it says he saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And it's interesting too, Dale, that when you have the creation of Eve, the woman, from the side of the man, the word there that is traditionally translated rib, it actually means side. It's interesting that when you do a word search on that, the word for rib or side, it is used of holy spaces like the temple. It refers to the wall of the temple. That word is used for the wall of the temple. And so it's interesting how the very word that Genesis 2 uses for the creation of the woman is the same word that is used for the construction of the temple. And it's no surprise that our bodies, you know, the Bible says that we are the temple of God. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so it recalls that aesthetic edifice that God had designed. And so I think we also associate beauty with order. Ugliness is usually associated with chaos. And so you've got these weird beasts in the Bible, you know, the beasts that come out of the water in Revelation 13 with 7 heads, and you know, it has 10 horns, and so you've got this chaotic ugliness, this ferocity. But when you read about you know, Christ as the Son of Man, or you read about Jesus as the Lamb of God, it doesn't conjure up this ferocity when you think of a lamb. And so I think that aesthetic concept is clearly there. There's no doubt about it. And it is associated with order, and I would even say with holiness.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, I think it is stronger than even my argument goes for and stuff like that. There is this ontological connection, speaking from a biblical perspective, where there are these correlations. And, you know, if you're an atheist, if I forget his name, Spiky Steve.
Yes.
Why are there these correlations? It just speaks in design that they're aligned, right? And why is it that the majority, if it's all random, why do the majority of humans all align to the same value? You know, most of us, 99% of us say, the same things are good. This is beautiful. A sunset's beautiful, not sewage, looking at raw sewage or a toilet seat or something like that. Why is there this correspondence that takes place?
And even when we look at you know, telescopic pictures of the universe, and we look at Saturn or Jupiter or the moons of Jupiter, I have never met a person in my life, Dale, that looked at that and said, well, that's ugly. They've said it is awe-inspiring. It is beautiful, the Milky Way. And they look at this, and I think, again, it's because there's order. There's order in place. The fine-tuning of the universe, for example. And so, I think you've made a very good case for beauty. I mean, the whole evolutionary view, in my opinion, I mean, everything in evolution, everything can be reduced to 2 things, as you know, survival and reproduction. And it's whatever aids that, you know, like Michael Russo's famous quip that morals are simply aids. They're just adaptations, aids to survival, but they're illusory at their very foundation. There's really no such thing as good and evil, or even beauty for that matter. But yeah, I think you made an excellent case in your presentation. So yeah, if there's any other questions, folks, Pam again mentioned there's vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor mentioned in the Bible as well. Yeah.
And just one thing, I'll just piggyback.
Sure.
So order, that thing that you just said, order, right? I think that would be sort of that's a sort of a dispositional property. When something's ordered, we God is disposed to respond, yes, that's valuable, that's good. And we in turn, as image bearers of God, that's why we like order and not chaos and stuff like that, because it's that dispositional property whereby we as aesthetic agents are disposed to value that. And
and even order in society. I mean, law and order. If we don't have law and order, then we have chaos, and we become the law of the jungle. And so I think anything that is orderly, like an ordered garden. I mean, gardens, the reason why we look at a garden, and people say, well, that's a beautiful garden. Look at those roses and look at these various beautiful flowers. Well, gardens don't naturally evolve that way. I mean, let's face it, Dale. I mean, gardens left to themselves without any gardener, your grass will be 8 feet high, and there'll be disorder. So the very concept of a garden presupposes this design, this beauty, and again, it's based on an order, a designer who put in those various plants and created this patch of lawn over here. I mean, that is all based on order, and we associate that, of course, with beauty. I mean, some neighborhoods, I'm sure you've seen them too, Dale. You go to some neighborhoods and it looks like a jungle in there. Some people have vacated the home. It's up for sale, or it's going to be redeveloped, and the garden just looks like a total jungle. And so again, I'm just looking at this idea of the idea of order and beauty. We associate beauty, and I think there's a correlation there with the concept of order as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, I fully agree with what you're saying. I love the analogy of the garden.
And how does it start? At the Garden of Eden, right? We have a garden, and what does God tell Adam to do? To care for it, to be its caretaker, and to till the ground. And so that maintains, again, it's a reflection. And I like what you said too. I think the Imago Dei, that we're made in the image of God, that let us make man in our image after our likeness. We're like God. We're not the same as God. We're not ontologically the same, but we are like God in that we imitate our Creator in our creativity. I mean, the fact that we have designed, it's astonishing that human beings were able to put together an aircraft that can take you from one place of the world to another. I mean, the very concept of technology and even artificial intelligence, the spacecraft, the magnitude of our scientific discoveries, and just the fact that humans had the capability to construct these various aircrafts and even the automobile. All of these things, the ingenuity behind all that, it doesn't just speak of order and beauty, but it speaks of our imago Dei, our connection to the Creator.
Absolutely, yeah. I think design itself, when we see things that are designed, that in itself is beautiful and stuff like that, because of this exact point that you're saying. Like, you find order to be beautiful, and when something's fulfilling its purpose. And
and there's a good comment here, I think, from Freddy Cosmic. Both are present. It's the contrast that hits us so hard. And there is a contrast. I mean, it's like the old saying. I mean, how can we speak of evil unless there is some objective standard of good? Or as Augustine called evil, oops, my light just went out there. The privation of the good, the taking away of the good. And so, it's like the contrast between light and darkness. And we know what darkness is because we know it's the absence of light. And I suppose the same would be true of beauty and ugliness or non-beauty. And so one implies the other. And so we live in that contrast for sure.
Again, in terms of like valuing it, right? So I think God has existing without creation, just fair to say, he has certain values and disvalues and stuff like that. So those do exist in him, but obviously there's nothing that actually exists that God disvalues until he creates and until the fall takes place and stuff like that. So there is no actualized evil or actualized ugliness or anything that God actually disvalues until the moment of the fall and stuff like that.
Right, and the idea of Augustine's view of that evil is the privation of the good. I like that concept, because you were talking about the Mona Lisa earlier, and it's if someone were to go and poke holes in the Mona Lisa, that would be a privation. It'd be a taking away from the wholeness of its beauty. And so in that sense, ugliness would be a privation of the beautiful.
Gotcha. Yeah. I like that view too. I'm not totally sure where I stand on that, though. I do think that it makes sense to speak of evil existing in potential form, not actualized form.
Sure.
Through God's disvalues. But one thing I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because I'm kind of curious. Obviously, in the normal debates between Christians and atheists or unbelievers and stuff on this issue, it's always, okay, our aesthetic values, are they just subjective? Is it all in the eye of the beholder, or is it objective?
In my experience, it has been in the subjective realm. I just need to attend to something very quickly.
Okay.
Maybe you can do a summary of what you just said, and I'll be right back. I just got to attend to something right here. I'll be right back.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thanks, Dale.
No worries. So what I was trying to ask Tony, and maybe you guys can let me know in the chat, but I think I'm not unique, but I am different from a lot of Christian apologists, where they want to argue that these values and judgments are objective. That's contrasting with the subjectivist view. Whereas I'm saying, well, they're actually grounded in both. A subject is needed. In this case, it's God as the subject that has the values. He's the one making the evaluation. He's a conscious subject with a mind. But also the objects themselves need to exist. The properties themselves are what dispose the agent to respond in the appropriate way. So it kind of says it's both objective and subjective in a sense. So I'm just curious what the audience thinks of that. We'll see if that comes in the chat soon. But Ringo Cat says, I've always believed, I remember running through fields as a kid, aged 8 or so, and being filled with joy at our Father. Suppressed that joy in my 20s and most of my 30s, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, like I said, we are designed to take joy and appreciate beautiful things, and it's good for us. It brings us happiness, not just any old happiness, but the profound happiness, right? This happiness that is consistent with our design plan. It's why we're here and stuff too. So yeah, I don't know if you heard that, Tony.
Yeah, I caught some of that. Thank you, Dale. Let me just bring up a comment here from Ringo Cat. I've always believed, I remember running through fields as a kid, aged 8 or so, and being filled with joy at our Father. Suppressed that joy in my 20s and most of my 30s, unfortunately. Yeah. So I'm assuming, Ringo, you're back. You're back in the Christian faith. That's my assumption.
Yeah. He's a friend. He's from Scotland.
Okay.
And,
oh, yes.
Believe it or not, I'll just say I showed a video. I mentioned how you baptized me, and that actually motivated and inspired Ringo to get baptized himself. So
hey, wonderful, good stuff, Ringo. And I'm sure Ringo is not a cat. We're talking to an actual human being. Not an orange tabby.
I've always made that assumption, but I've never asked. So
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, that's great. That's great. Yeah, and there's okay, Ringo. Nice to hear that, brother. Absolutely great to hear that. God bless you. Okay. In terms of reaching out to you, Dale, I put some information there. Can you tell people a little bit about your ministry and what Real Seeker Ministry is about?
Yeah, absolutely. Real Seeker Ministries, I'm the host of a podcast. So I specialize in the philosophy of religion topics and also Christian apologetics, obviously. And I try to have a wide range of topics. I'm probably most well known for my Shroud Wars series, where I bring on experts on both sides to actually debate various topics and get into a lot of depth on some of the issues related to the Shroud of Turin. But beyond that, I like to be a jack of all trades. I like talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection, existence of God, from the ontological argument, moral argument, cosmological argument, a whole range of topics. In fact, I'm actually going to be inspired by Tony. I'm going to be teaching a solo series probably in September. I took a world religions class with Tony that I thought was really well done. So I want to share that with my audience and stuff like that. Like, talking about how do we approach Hinduism or Buddhism from a Christian perspective. So, yeah.
Well, that's awesome. That's awesome. That's great, Dale. And so I've got all the links in the description box if you want to know more about Dale's work, his website. And again, if you want, or your church wants to have a presentation on the Shroud of Turin, I'd highly recommend Dale. So if you're in the Toronto GTA area, his email is also in the description box. Or if you want him to do a virtual lecture, that'd be great as well. So before I go, folks, I just wanted to mention, as I usually do, just two of my books, No King But Christ, The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Secular Worldviews. This book deals with the place of the Christian in our current world. How do we deal with social justice? How do we deal with transgenderism? It all comes back to what Dale and I have been talking about, and that is the grounding of morality, the grounding of our sexual gender. Who defines us sexually? Is it the government? Is it you? And so I deal with a number of those issues, and also the supremacy of Christ's kingship. So that link is in the description box. If you're interested in early Christian creeds and hymns, I've written a book in that area as well, where you could find the various creeds of Christianity. And I'm talking way before the Nicene Creed and Apostles' Creed, how you can find these creeds entrenched in the very text of Scripture. And also, you may not know this, but there's hymns as well. That's right. Early Christians have been singing. We've been singing for 2,000 years. And so there's particular hymns in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament as well. So all of that is in the description box. And also, if you guys are interested, just came to mind, I'm teaching a course on archaeology of the ancient Near East in the Bible at the University of Toronto, but this will be in class. So unfortunately, I'm not asking for you to fly into Toronto to take the courses, but if you are in Toronto, they will be at the University of Toronto. I'll put a link to that course in the description box as well. And thank you so much. Fernie Cosmic says, already bought the book. I'll be reading it soon. Thank you so much. And let me know what you think. And please place a review on Amazon for me if you could kindly do so. Well, thank you so much, Dale. I really appreciate you, brother. And I am just so happy and encouraged to see how far you've come. You've become a theologian, philosopher of sorts, and I really appreciate the work you're doing and the fact that you have been influencing a lot of folks and that the Lord's been using you. So I'm just so happy to hear that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I thank you so much for always supporting me and being a great mentor and always encouraging me to grow in the Lord and stuff like that.
Always, Dale. Always, Dale. I mean, you're my brother and I guess my little brother. But yeah, so always, you make me proud, very, very proud. and I know that the Lord has a lot of great stuff ahead of you in terms of your ministry. So, folks, thanks you again for being with us. Thank you for giving up your evening, wherever you may be on planet Earth. And we encourage you to subscribe to Dale's channel as well, and subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. We've got all types of topics on my channel. It's not just the aesthetics moral argument for God. We've got everything from Islam to cults to theology. It's just a very, very broad channel that deals with diverse topics. So take a look at that, and please subscribe. So thanks again, everyone, and God bless you. And I trust that this teaching session tonight has been a blessing, that it's built you up, and that you'll add more arrows to your quiver, so to speak, your apologetics quiver. So thank you again, everyone. The Lord bless you, and have a good night. And until next time, see you soon. Bye for now.